The briefing is brought to you in association with Spain. From the wilds of the Atlantic to the warmth of Mediterranean isles, the Spanish coast has something for every occasion. And whether chartering a yacht or renting a more modest motorboat, there's no better way to explore this magical country's lesser-known highlights than from the open water. Listen out for a new summer season of The Concierge on Monocle Radio. Join Robert Bound and friends as they turn navigator for an unforgettable journey along the Spanish coast. From hidden gems to legendary gastronomy, and with the unique drama of the America's Cup in the host city of Barcelona added to the mix, discover why the time is right to take to the waves. The Concierge, returning to Monocle Radio in July. This summer, set sail for Spain.
You are listening to The Briefing, first broadcast on the 19th of August 2024 on Monocle Radio. Hello and welcome to The Briefing, broadcasting live from Studio One here at Midori House in London. I'm Chris Chermak. Coming up on today's programme.
This is a decisive moment, probably the best, maybe the last opportunity to get the hostages home.
U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken is in the Middle East trying to secure a ceasefire just as the Democratic National Convention kicks off in Chicago today. We'll explore how one event may affect the other. After that, we head to the South China Sea, where a collision between Chinese and Filipino ships is ratcheting up tensions. We'll also look at the first major test to Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi's third term in office. And finally...
No, I was not supposed to be an actor. By the way, I didn't know what I was going to do.
We will explore the life and legacy of French cinema icon Alain Delon. All that right here on The Briefing with me, Chris Chermak. The Democratic National Convention kicks off in Chicago later today, and while it would be easy to jump on the Kamala Harris enthusiasm bandwagon of the past 4 weeks, the hard part begins now. Honeymoons end, and there are 2.5 months until the actual U.S. presidential election. Democratic unity is already fracturing somewhat, with the promise of thousands of people showing up in Chicago to protest Joe Biden's administration's handling of the war in the Middle East. So the question for this week is, how can Kamala Harris set herself up with a message that will last until the 5th of November, and can the Democrats stay united long enough to win? Well, I'm joined first of all from Florida by Scott Lucas, adjunct professor at the Clinton Institute University College Dublin. Scott, the DNC is kicking off while U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken is in the Middle East right now. Let's start with that. What are the prospects that Blinken comes home with an actual ceasefire deal?
None and none. And I need to explain that answer. We're getting reports this morning, and they're coming out through the Israeli media and other outlets in the region, that there was absolutely no progress in the talks that took place, being brokered by, the U.S., Egypt, and Qatar between Israel and Hamas. And that didn't surprise me. I said going into the talks that you weren't going to have progress for two reasons. One is just the simple statement of fact that on July 31st, Israel killed Hamas's political head and one of its top negotiators in the talks, Ismail Haniyeh, when he was in Iran. You don't advance talks by killing the other side's negotiator. And secondly, it's Benjamin Netanyahu. The cold reality of this is that unless Netanyahu can go before the Israeli public and say that Hamas is defeated, and that means with its top command, not just Haniyeh, but also its military commanders, especially Yahya Sinwar, killed, unless he can show the Israelis a decimated organization, and unless he can get the hostages back, he is in a position where he has to continue this conflict. If he doesn't, his political future is in jeopardy because of early elections, and his legal future is in jeopardy because of the resumption of a trial on bribery charges. So Netanyahu, in effect, is pursuing an open-ended war, and that open-ended war cannot end in any type of negotiated agreement with Hamas, short of a complete Hamas capitulation.
And Scott, if we are that sort of pessimistic about the prospects for a ceasefire deal, I wonder what that means for Antony Blinken and, to bring it to the Democratic National Convention in Chicago. How much are these two stories connected in your mind? Is there something that Blinken and the Biden administration would need to show American voters, but particularly Democrats, that they can trust the Biden administration to have a handle on this?
Well, I think in fairness to Blinken and the State Department, whatever criticisms, and I've got many of the Biden administration's ongoing support for Israel, I don't think they're looking back to Chicago and the Harris campaign in terms of what they're doing. I think what they're trying to do is to isolate Netanyahu by appealing to others within Israel, which is the key point. They're playing to an Israeli leadership and more broadly to an Israeli public, which says, do you really want to keep doing this? If you ask what's going to happen to the Democratic National Convention, I think if, back on July 21st, when Kamala Harris succeeded Joe Biden, I think there was a lot of worry there that there could be real problems here for the Democrats, especially in a swing state like Michigan, with the ongoing conflict, because Michigan has got America's largest Arab American population. But something interesting happened in the next few weeks after that, and that is far from continuing to run into polling trouble in Michigan, Harris reversed what was a 4 to 6% deficit that Biden was suffering and turned it into a 4% lead in the polls in Michigan. So despite the Gaza issue, even in Michigan, the Democrats are in pretty good shape. Does that mean I don't think, that the Democratic National Convention should not be concerned with Israel-Gaza? I think they should be. I think they should acknowledge the protests that are taking place. But I think those protests will be acknowledged. I think Kamala Harris, again, to give you another tip-off, a couple of weeks ago, she mishandled the protest and some heckling when she simply told people in Michigan, look, you're just going to help Donald Trump get elected. Well, that's not sufficient to address the issue. At the very next rally in Arizona, she actually went off script and responded to the hecklers and said, look, we know this is a serious issue. We need a ceasefire now. Now, she may not be able to deliver that ceasefire, but at least recognition of that, I think, goes some way to mitigating the protests that you'll see this week.
Well, and on that point then, in terms of how Kamala Harris has been handling this, Scott, tonight we will hear, though, from Joe Biden in Chicago as well. So it does kind of connect these two issues, doesn't it? He'll be throwing his weight behind Kamala Harris and sort of passing the torch. But how much does his legacy impact hers? Do you think she will be looking to separate herself from him on issues like Gaza and everything else, for that matter, over the coming days?
Well, even on Gaza, she was detaching herself a bit from Biden's position well before he stepped out of the race. If you go back and looked at what she started saying this spring, she started putting an emphasis on Gaza civilians, on the humanitarian issues, as well as on the prospect that they could be killed by the Israeli military. Now, she wasn't going to go so far as to say that America needs to cut off military aid to Israel. That's not going to happen. She wasn't calling for an unconditional ceasefire. That's not going to happen. But she gave herself a little bit of space to say, look, I'm not Joe Biden on this issue. And again, I think that continues this week. And I think it's continuing on other issues as well. But here, and now I will let cynicism creep in just a bit. I think the reason why you have Biden appear on Monday, in part, is to pass the torch. That's fair enough. But you get him out of the way. You get him out of the way early because we know that he carries baggage, not necessarily on domestic issues, but he carries baggage because this was the old guy who couldn't win if he stayed in the race. So you get him out of the way. You then bring in, the Clintons, you bring in Obama, you bring in all the stars, and of course, Harris and Waltz make their speeches. So I think the Biden legacy doesn't hang over this convention, at least the negative aspects of that legacy.
Scott Lucas, thank you very much for joining us. And joining me now here in the studio for more is Monocle's foreign editor, Lex Self. Lex, good to have you here.
Thank you for having me, Chris.
Let's start kind of following off from what Scott was talking about there. This challenge of Kamala Harris essentially defining herself, separating herself from Joe Biden and defining who she is, which is really what this convention is going to be about. To Scott's point, once Joe Biden is out of the way, this becomes Kamala Harris's convention. What have you made of her efforts so far in the last 4 weeks to try and do that?
Well, the fact that it's 4 weeks just speaks to how hyper fast the news cycle is nowadays. And, her candidacy so far has been one of the internet, basically. She's benefited from a wave of excitement around, due for the most part to the fact that, she's neither Donald Trump nor indeed is she Joe Biden. And she's therefore seen as the new and the unknown, though I think the fact that she is seen as unknown despite having run for the Democratic nomination before and having been vice president for the past 4 years says a lot about how successful or not she has been in defining herself, either in terms of her personality or her policy expertise. And so far, I think the parts, at least of her personality, that have gained traction are those that Donald Trump and J.D. Vance have attacked. The fact that she is childless, her upbringing, her racial identity. These are things that Trump and Vance have decided to go after, and those attacks haven't landed. And I think Harris's team have been good at kind of co-opting those and turning those back at Trump. In the same vein, she's benefited from the support of, I think, the internet, the kind of Gen Z internet user, if you will, if that's a developing kind of, constituency, and on certain platforms which actually do have a lot of influence in kind of swaying certain voters, TikTok, Twitter, have helped her gain early momentum.
Both the social media aspect of this, but also the rallies, to be fair, as well. She has sort of generated a tremendous amount of excitement at the rallies. So she's been very long on energy at the moment, as you say, hasn't she? But she hasn't spoken to the press much. She's been short on press conferences or press media interviews, and kind of short on policy, I think it's fair to say as well, which does make me think of another candidate who has recently won, that being Keir Starmer here in the UK. He was kind of similar, tacking to the middle ground, not very specific on policy, and it worked for him.
Yeah, although I think with Labour and Starmer, they did have some quite radical policies when he won the party leadership that they shed over time as a tactic in order to appeal to kind of as broad a church of the electorate as they could. Soaring rhetoric and Keir Starmer aren't necessarily two things I would put together. But
that is a fair point.
But, what Harris does have that Starmer also was faced with was an electoral system that, as I said, suits the broad church candidate, while targeting specific wedge issues in certain swing constituencies. As Lucas was saying, the kind of Muslim American vote in Michigan, that is very much dependent on perhaps what's going on in the Middle East at the moment and Harris's view on that. And then, another previously ironclad Democratic constituency, which is the Latino vote, has also been wavering. And I think a large part of that has been to do with immigration and what's seen as the kind of Democratic failure in that regard. I think if Harris can come up with two kind of cogent and effective plans to tackle those two issues, then, that would be going a long way to really defining herself, although that's not exactly a straightforward thing to do.
You did mention Donald Trump and his vice presidential candidate, J.D. Vance. They've been struggling to figure out a message to sort of attack Kamala Harris with. Donald Trump is also, I guess, gone back to his roots somewhat, it feels like, in kind of making somewhat personal attacks, going after race. He's also, in general, I think fair to say, kind of, even though he was a president, styling himself as the anti-establishment, the one who's going to shake things up, change everything about the way the U.S. works. Do we feel like Kamala Harris needs to do the same thing? Does she need to separate herself from Joe Biden? Does she need to separate herself from the establishment? Does she need to, in order to maintain, I guess, this fresh, new energy, does she need to set herself up as the anti-establishment candidate as well? Is that kind of the mood you get the sense from the U.S.? That's what it's about at the moment.
To an extent,
competence.
To an extent, I think she has, more importantly, to set herself up as the anti-Trump candidate, but in a way that doesn't exclude, or vilify the typical Trump voter. I think the Biden government has actually achieved a great deal, and not necessarily along pro-establishment lines. His government strengthened unions and workers' rights while going after big corporations that break the rules. I think these are popular kind of cross-partisan moves in 21st century America. And I think, she would do well to kind of stress the achievements in those regards. I think, as I said, the most important thing she can do is present herself as a unifying candidate and one who harbours no ill will towards the typical Trump voter, something that I think Biden managed to do quite effectively in 2020 and which Hillary Clinton did not in 2016. I think that's the great challenge here, not just in terms of this election, but also in the future of American politics, and one that actually so far she hasn't really seemed up to.
And just finally and quickly, what of her support crew? Is there anyone you're going to be watching out for during this Democratic convention the next few days? We'll have Joe Biden tonight, we'll have the Obamas, we'll have the Clintons, we'll have the Vice President Tim Walz, and we'll have Harris herself. Who are you going to be most intrigued to listen to?
I think, Scott was talking about the Clintons, and I think they would probably be wise to sit this one out. I think we're past the Clintons, and the Clintons being, something that's going to elicit excitement and support. But hey, I'm not the one who's planning the itinerary. I think Obama's skill as an orator will always mean he has value. But I think Walz is he's an exciting, at least we don't know much about his policies but in terms of his identity, this kind of folksy Midwestern dad who is pro-union and progressive and looks like he could pro guns in a way, or pro shooting, he looks like he knows his way around a chainsaw, is very interesting if as I say we're going to look to a future the US might drag itself out of the kind of mire of polarization and political violence towards a kind of more equitable and unified future. I think Walz is key in that regard.
Thank you very much, Lex. That was Monocle's Foreign Affairs editor, Alexis Self. And now here's Laura Kramer with the day's other news headlines.
Thanks, Chris. North Korea has condemned Ukraine's incursion of Russia, calling it an unforgivable act of terror, and accused Washington of supporting the attack. The foreign ministry reiterated its support for Russia through its state media. North Korea has dramatically upgraded its ties with Moscow in the past year, with 2 summit meetings by their leaders who pledged closer cooperation in all areas. Libya's central bank has suspended all operations following the abduction of its information technology director. Other employees have been threatened with kidnapping by an unidentified party. The U.S. ambassador to Libya warned that attempting to replace the leadership of the CBL by force can result in Libya losing access to international financial markets. And the European Space Agency's spacecraft named JUICE will conduct a historic flyby of the Moon and Earth tomorrow. JUICE will fly directly over Southeast Asia and the Pacific Ocean on its way to Jupiter, using Earth's gravity to alter its speed and trajectory. Those are the day's headlines. Back to you, Chris.
Thanks very much, Laura. JUICE from the European Space Agency. To the Philippines now, which once again is facing tensions with China after the collision of 2 ships in the South China Sea earlier today. The 2 sides are blaming each other for the accident, but whoever is to blame, this comes amid a series of incidents in which the 2 sides are kind of circling each other at the moment in the disputed waters and threatening escalation if the other does not back off. Well, I'm joined now by Richard Heydarian, an academic and columnist for the Philippine Daily Inquirer based in Manila. Richard, you were this morning, or today I should say, at a press conference about today's incident. What can you tell us?
Yeah, actually this morning I corralled a group of experts and also government officials from the Philippine Coast Guard and the National Security Council for discussing broader issues about Philippine foreign policy, especially ahead of U.S. elections. But next thing we know, there was a breaking news, and as we were conducting the forum, details were coming in, and more updates and more alarming updates. I mean, initially we thought there was a kind of a small collision that led to a few inches of damage in one of the Philippine ships. The next thing we know, there were 2 Filipino ships which were damaged by their Chinese counterparts in the disputed areas in the Spratly group of islands, and one of them had a huge hole in it. So it just underscores how fragile the situation is, how potentially explosive the situation is. And this comes just weeks after the Philippines and China tried to de-escalate tensions over another contested shoal, the second Thomas Shoal, where the Philippines has a de facto military facility. From my understanding, it looks like the Chinese were fearing that the Filipinos were about to engage in military fortification in the Sabina Shoal, which is also claimed by China. But from my understanding, there was a misunderstanding there in a sense that I think China misread the situation. The Philippines, I think, was en route to other disputed land features and not necessarily in the Sabina Shoal. But for the Chinese, I think they didn't want to take any risks in a sense that they wanted to remind the Philippines who's the big boss and remind the Philippines of just the expansiveness of their areas and the number of disputed features between the two countries in the South China Sea.
Well, and Richard, when you talk there about China wanting to remind the Philippines who is the big boss, I mean, are you getting the sense, though, at this moment that the Philippines is also trying to perhaps remind China that it has something to say here, maybe running out of some patience with all of these different incidents in the disputed waters? Have they been looking to send a message that China's actions will not be tolerated?
Absolutely. I think the Philippines' open announcement that it turned down offer of assistance by the United States, which has the Mutual Defense Treaty Alliance with the Philippines, during an earlier, even more violent incident whereby a Filipino naval serviceman lost a finger. There were injuries there over the second Thomas Shoal. The Philippines made it very clear, we are here, we're going to stand on our own. We don't need other major powers to get involved. We're not there yet, and we can handle our own situation. I think the Filipinos are proving to be defiant and plucky, and I think the Chinese are really struggling to come to terms with this version of the Philippines because for 6 years they had Rodrigo Duterte, a very pro-China, anti-Western president who tried to wrap, whatever tensions or incident that happened in the South China Sea under the rug. In fact, we had multiple incidents also in the past. But former President Duterte always tried to essentially lawyer for China. I think now China is realizing that Ferdinand Marcos Jr. is no friend of China and that he's going to assert the Philippine claims in the area.
And at the same time, though, then, Richard, I mean, how far is Ferdinand Marcos Jr. willing to go with this? Clearly, at the same time, neither side would want a full-blown conflict. I mean, that's obviously where this would potentially end.
Oh, yeah. I mean, an armed attack by China will automatically trigger the Mutual Defense Treaty with the United States. So China, it doesn't only have to deal with the plucky Philippines, which is fortifying its position on the ground, buying new vessels from Japan, upgrading also its naval capacity. But China doesn't want to also deal with the United States. Obviously, the U.S. also is not in the mood to pick a fight as the election nears. So I think this is still a situation of gray zone strategy used by China, using aggression, using intimidation, but just short of armed attack. So the challenge for Marcos Jr. of the Philippines is how to coordinate it with allies and friends and how to raise the diplomatic and other sorts of cost for China so that they don't use the most aggressive toolkit in their gray zone strategy, because this is as gray as it can get. And we're just sort of, again, flirting with armed confrontation here.
Just finally on that point then, for the Philippines and Marcos Jr., I mean, do you worry to some degree that perhaps he is overplaying his hand here? Is that possible as well? His confidence that the U.S. and other allies would actually come to the Philippines' aid and start another conflict when there are so many currently around the world, is that perhaps a little bit overblown?
Yeah, I think, the sense in the Philippines is that, it has to also draw the line because for far too long, the Philippines was the laggard. The Malaysians and the Vietnamese were already claiming extended continental shelf in 2009. The Vietnamese have been ramming their boats into the Chinese boats for the past decade. Even the Malaysians, who on the surface look like pro-China and very anti-Western in light of the situation in Gaza right now, behind the scenes, of course, they also unilaterally develop oil and gas resources in some part of the South China. And interestingly, even the Indonesians, who don't have a direct claim, they have been pushing back against China because of the expansive nature of China's claim that go all the way into the Natuna area of Indonesia. So actually, the Philippines is the laggard, and now it's playing a catch-up time. And that's why it looks like the Philippines is pushing things too far. But actually, we're just catching up with the rest of the pack.
Very interesting. Richard, thank you very much for joining us. That was Richard Heydarian in the Philippines. You're listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. This is The Briefing on Monocle Radio. I'm Chris Chermak. It has been just over 2 months since India's election dealt a blow to Prime Minister Narendra Modi, but nevertheless secured him a third term in office with a coalition. Now he's facing perhaps the biggest challenge to his new term, with doctors holding a national strike protesting against the rape and murder of a female colleague earlier this month. Modi has condemned the attack, but given that the crime brings back memories of a similarly gruesome incident from 2012, there are questions about what exactly Modi has done about it. Well, Maya Sharma is a journalist in Bengaluru and joins me from there now. Maya, first of all, how much of an impact are these doctor strikes having on medical services in the country?
The doctor strike has shut down OPD services, outpatient department services, in many hospitals across the country, but they are trying to make sure that emergency services continue. This is an attempt really by the doctors to draw attention to what they say is an ongoing situation: lack of safety, lack of comfort, lack of facilities, really, especially for doctors who are working shifts of 36 hours, 48 hours, no places to rest, no separate toilets for women. A whole series of complaints being raised by these doctors, of course, triggered by the terrible rape and murder of the young woman in the Kolkata hospital. So patients, yes, they have been affected if they're outpatient or non-emergency, but even during the protests, the doctors have been trying to continue with emergency services.
And how has Prime Minister Narendra Modi responded to this so far, both to that initial murder on the 9th of August and now to the strikes and protests?
Prime Minister Narendra Modi did, of course, condemn the attack, has spoken about the safety of women at the Independence Day speech that he gave on the 15th of August this month, which was some days after that terrible, terrible crime was discovered. He has spoken about the need for safety of women, but because the state in which it happened, West Bengal, is actually ruled by the Trinamool Congress, which is an opposition party, there are concerns that it's become a political slingfest. Political parties are just throwing jibes at each other, saying that it's an opposition-ruled state, which is why the government, central government, is paying attention to it. This time, there's quite a terrible sense of whataboutery, saying, don't rapes happen in states ruled by the BJP also? So it has been very disturbing, really, the political response overall to this issue, with people trying to score political points, even talk of whether Mamata Banerjee, the chief minister of West Bengal, the only woman chief minister in the country, is actually liable to step down. There have been calls for her resignation, there have been calls for her to step down over this crime. And while, of course, it has to be taken terribly seriously, there are questions being raised as to how much politics is involved in this outrage. And is the outrage really being felt by political leaders themselves?
And Maya, is there a sense then in India, I wonder, when you talk about that polarization and the sort of political back and forth, that I wonder if almost a dam has been broken. This election that we just had in India showed the opposition their strength, showed people that they are not afraid to speak out and challenge Modi's authority, because he was seen as a semi-authoritarian, frankly, before that. Is that part of what this is about as well?
Well, it has, of course, shown that the BJP is not all-powerful, that Prime Minister Modi is not all-powerful, that the very presence of a leader of the opposition in the parliament has made a difference to the way parliament is being conducted, and perhaps has encouraged people to raise their voices. As I said, muddying the waters is the fact that this is an opposition-ruled state where this latest huge horror has taken place. But remember, there has been outrage over rape in India before. We have that horrific 2012 rape in a moving bus, the young woman eventually dying. It's an ongoing problem in India. We have 87 rapes reported each day in the country, and these are the rapes that are reported. Many are not reported because out of a misguided sense of shame, a feeling of stigmatization. It is a terrible situation for women's safety in India. People who say so are often being criticized with the not all men line that I think the Me Too movement also faced. But it is a huge issue, and politicians across the board are probably not taking it seriously enough, not doing enough to actually make sure that women of India feel safe.
Maya, thank you very much for joining us. That was the Indian journalist Maya Sharma. This is The Briefing. And finally on today's show, we turn to France, where President Emmanuel Macron is among those who has led tributes to the actor Alain Delon, who passed away over the weekend at the age of 88. Delon was a star of French film from the 1960s and 70s, in particular in films such as Le Samouraï.
Que voulez-vous? Vous tuer.
What a retro return there. I'm joined now for more on the life and legacy of Alain Delon by film critic Karen Krzanovich. Karen, I love that little clip that we played, very Western there. How big a French star are we talking about here with Alain Delon?
Well, they're calling him the very last French film star. I think we're talking about an end of an era, really. I mean, this is sort of like Marlon Brando or James Dean. In fact, he was likened to James Dean. Alain Delon was born in 1935, and it's one of these magical discovery stories where he went into the military, had a unhappy sort of home life, and was discovered by hanging out with actors when he went to the Cannes Film Festival. And he was initially actually offered an American contract because of his great looks and what they call star quality. But he decided to stay in France. It's not for nothing he was known as the ice-cold angel, because he had a face that the camera just loved.
What was it about him, in addition, though, to the good looks and what you described there? He had charm, also kind of a dark character, or something that he also played in movies. You couldn't really pin him down very easily, could you?
No, he's called mysterious, and I think it's mainly because we're so blinded by his looks. I mean, there's a reason why people become stars. It's not only charisma and presence, or riz, if you will. It's the fact that they represent us on the screen, and we in our own minds, we're these beautiful creatures. And so I think we get blinded to the people that actors are, and of course, his mystery was the fact that he seemed to fall in love with very famous, beautiful women, and then just sort of leave. Had a lot of children, or quite a few, and then some he wouldn't acknowledge either. And so his personal life and his political life, and certain statements that he made later in his life sort of followed him on. So he was a complicated character, but in a way, he was just iconic. I mean, without him, we wouldn't have the ice-cold killers that are so popular in cinema.
You mentioned his personal political characteristics there as well. I do wonder if that makes him in some way particularly French, to be honest. Would he have succeeded if he had gone to Hollywood and taken that first offer?
Could he have learned English as well? Possibly. Yes, I mean, there does seem to be a type of French star, and there are many that are acceptable in one generation, and now what they're saying and how they're acting and the political leanings that they have are now being questioned. And so I don't think so. I mean, I don't think that he's a star for the woke age, but saying that, you will see more pictures of him as Le Samouraï, as the trench coat wearing blue-eyed killer on Instagram or TikTok or anywhere than you will anyone else right now. And it's because the image, like Marilyn Monroe, like James Dean, his image just echoes down the corridors of cinematic fame.
Just finally then on that, Karen, I mean, how much did he represent French film? What did he do for the French film industry, would you say?
I think he gave it a certain tang, a certain coolness, a certain chic. And also, it's the first time that we saw the killers sort of being charming in a way. I mean, he's like an anti-hero. And I think that's uniquely French, that you could have some, good-looking guy who's just rude, basically. But we all want to be him. And I think that is very typically Gallic of the 60s and 70s.
Rude and charming at the same time. Karen, thank you very much for joining us. That was the film critic Karen Krzanovich, and that's all the time we have for this edition of The Briefing. It's produced by Christy O'Grady. Our researchers were Gunnar Grunlid and Sana Jumani, and our studio manager was Mariella Bevan. The Briefing is back tomorrow at the same time. I'm Chris Chermak. Goodbye, and thanks for listening.